Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. My name is Laszlo Kontler. I'm a historian here and also prorector for Social Science and Humanities. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all at the 6th or 7th of the CU Humanities lectures. The Humanities lectures, which we initiated a couple of years ago, are themselves part of a larger initiative, which we call the CU Humanities Initiative. This will be known to most of you, so I'm not going to talk long about this, but just to frame the event, let me share a couple of thoughts with you. The humanities have had a fairly bad press in the past couple of years. They have never been doing very well, but there has been a perceptible atmosphere of adversity around the humanities, of which my favorite illustration is a sentence by one of the recent state secretaries for higher education in Hungary. We have had a number of them in the past couple of years. This is a changing territory, but anyway, this gentleman whose background is in fact in geography happened to say at one point, when justifying certain changes that have been taking place in the funding of higher education in Hungary in the recent years. So the gentleman said that we have to take it for granted, and we have to acknowledge that the areas of knowledge in the academic fields which produce value these days are the natural sciences and the engineering sciences. So they are the ones that deserve support, encouragement, and so forth, and they are the ones on whose accomplishments and achievements the future of our societies is built. Now, I don't think that I need to emphasize the flatness of this perspective to this particular audience, but in any case, in this atmosphere, the management of Central European University thought that, as we usually do, we should go against the tide and do something against it as far as our modest means allow. Actually, the humanities and the social sciences, as you know, are very firmly anchored in CU's past. The university was born in the firm belief that social progress is inconceivable without offering sound academic training in exactly the social sciences of humanity and humanities. So this is which continues to be on the banner of CU. So we started what we call the Humanities Initiative, which has had two pillars. One of them is indeed this lecture series in which we have hosted a number of very distinguished guests who were largely talking about the bridges between and possibilities of cross-fertilization between the social sciences and humanities for the sake of achieving some relevance in our societies these days. The other pillar has been inviting Central European University faculty to submit projects largely by way of interdisciplinary studies within the humanities and the social sciences. And we have received a high number of very exciting and encouraging ideas from colleagues. These include quest for sponsorship for interdepartmental initiatives, educational as well as research specializations in religious studies, in Eastern Mediterranean studies, in political thought, in science studies and other fields. One of the most recent proposals has been to initiate a structured and hopefully broadening preoccupation at CU with digital humanities. And it is into this complex framework that the lecture that we are going to have today is envisaged. We are fortunate today to have a foremost representative of one of the flagship institutions worldwide in the field of digital humanities, Father Columba Stewart. A warm welcome to you and thanks for being with us. I'm very excited about the opportunity to hear from you, and let me request István Percer to introduce our speaker and the talk in more detail. Thank you very much.
So it's a difficult task to introduce Father Columba. So, thinking about how I should do it, I thought I should organize such a presentation, and I would organize it in 3 points. First point, he is an excellent patristic scholar, Syriacist, and historian of monasticism. He earned his PhD in Oxford with the greatest living Syriacist scholar, Sebastian Brock, and his PhD working the earth of the heart about Pseudo-Macarius, the spiritual homilies attributed to Saint Macarius of Egypt, but in fact written in Greek in a Mesopotamian context, as Father Columba has shown. That was a tour de force. It's a very good book about that. I just asked him before that whether I am allowed to say that most probably the author is Simon of Mesopotamia, who is considered to be the leader of the Messianian heretic movement, and reluctantly he agreed to say so. No, not reluctantly, he agreed to say so. So it's a great book about a very complex text which has been in the center of monastic spirituality for centuries, and which is very controversial and very interesting. He also wrote about another foundational text for monasticism, this time not text, a person for monasticism. It is titled Cassian the Monk, about John Cassian. We had never thought that this founder of Western monasticism would become controversial, but recently he has become, because now his existence is doubted by a Greek scholar called Panayotis Samalikos, and Father Columba's long book review about Samalikos claimed that John Cassian has never existed, is published already, I think. Okay, so this is a very good book, I can recommend it. And the third big book which is in preparation is about the first 1,000 years of the monastic movement. Second, he is a Benedictine monk, a member of St. John's Abbey, correct, in Collegeville, which has a university, St. John's University, and this university has an institute, the Hill Museum and Monastic Library, which is for the preservation, which has many purposes. Among others, it houses St. John's Bible, but it is also there for archival preservation. They started microfilming. Father Columba will tell, in Europe, in Ethiopia, and ever since 2003, when Father Columba was appointed executive director of this institution, it turned digital, and it turned toward the most urgent tasks of digital preservation. And Father Columba testified to an incredible foresight in initiating the digitization of endangered manuscripts in the Middle East. So now thousands and thousands of manuscripts are gone, destroyed, but many of them are virtually preserved in HMML, Hill Museum Manuscript Library, and Father Columba will speak about this. And so the third point is this: he is a high-tech entrepreneur who is putting his talent in the service not only of humanities but also of heritage preservation, and also of counteracting the barbarism that is now prevailing in many parts of the world. And I had to say this because he will, I think, give a modest preservation. Recently, The Economist published an article about their work, Archivists of Faith, that was, I think, the title, how these Benedictine monks from the US are preserving Muslim manuscripts in Africa and the Middle East. I think I have spoken too much.
Thank you very much, Istvan. I don't think I agreed about Simeon of Mesopotamia, so we can have that conversation afterwards with anyone who's interested. So I'm very grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Some of you know us from our old name, which was the Hill Monastic Manuscript Library, a name that we changed in 2004 because people thought all we photographed were monastic manuscripts, and that's not true. And now we are photographing Islamic manuscripts as well as Christian, so all the more reason to broaden the scope indicated by our name. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we do the work that we do, then a little bit about the history of our project, then a little bit about how we do what we do with just a little bit of technical information, and I can provide more to those who are interested afterwards. Then speak a little bit about some of the areas of the world where we are working, with a particular accent on places in the Middle East and Africa where manuscript culture, along with other cultural heritage, is very much endangered. And then finally sum it up with some numbers to give you some idea of the magnitude of what we've done, always in partnership with local organizations and individuals. And then at the end, I think of particular interest to many people here, how you can actually access these images, because we are, many of us here, people who depend on manuscripts either directly or indirectly for the research that we do. So, are you ready? Okay, so this is going to be a kind of action-packed adventure, fast ride through lots of history and technical details with a travelogue component. So I like to begin these presentations by showing people this image, which does two things at once. The first thing it does is it suggests the fragility of a manuscript, because you see one of the threats that manuscripts face, which is simply environmental risk. So in this case, insect damage. It is the demonstration that the English metaphor of a bookworm is not simply a metaphor, but that there are creatures that eat books. Although, as I like to point out, this is a literate insect, because you see that the words are not actually eaten, but all of the edges are. The second reason I like to show this photograph is that when a general audience sees it, they see Arabic. And when they see Arabic, what do they assume? It's an Islamic manuscript. Of course, in fact, it's a Christian manuscript. It's a Byzantine Rite, Horologion, used by Arabic language Christians in Lebanon and Syria. So part of what I try to do in these introductions, perhaps not so much for you, but for other audiences, is to complicate their understanding of the cultural medley which is on the ground in places like the Middle East, although even as I speak to you today, that is evaporating. So part of what we're doing is telling the story of a number of overlapping cultures which are gradually being forced apart. So you have the fragility of a manuscript which is finding itself now in a world which is seeing this real-time cultural devastation. So some of you will recognize the beautiful mosque from Aleppo, which is a wonder of very simple medieval Islamic architecture. And this is the state of it about 3 years ago. I haven't seen a more recent photograph, but just for reference, that is the lovely 16th century minaret and what's left of it. Or in Homs, which as many of you know has been one of the most fiercely contested and largely destroyed cities in the Syrian civil war, the remains of the Church of Mary's Belt which is a Syrian Orthodox church where we digitize manuscripts before the Syrian conflict. It's a pre-Christian temple upon which was built the 4th century Christian church, then a 19th century new church. So as is so often typical of these locations, it has always been a sacred place. It's just that it keeps changing its particular affiliation depending on who's in power. Or, of course, the images that all of us have seen from Palmyra, the remains of the Great Triumphal Arch. Perhaps some of you had the opportunity to see it. I was there a couple of times, marveling at the engineering of the great hinged arch, which looked as if it were perpendicular no matter which direction you came at it from, on a great triumphal way, which itself was not straight. Or, in Iraq, the destruction of the tombs of Mar Bainam and his sister Sarah, very important monastic site outside of Mosul, a very important manuscript collection, part of the area that was conquered by ISIS in the summer of 2014, and the manuscript collection of this particular monastery is now missing. I'll say a little bit about what we may have done to make sure that it's safe. Or another threat, which is less dramatically evident in the kind of news media that many of us are consuming regularly, and that is the threat that comes to manuscripts which are still on the loose. So in places like Ethiopia, manuscripts are not locked up in museums and libraries, as they tend to be in the West, but instead they are still to be found in many churches, many monasteries. And I use the example of Yeha in northern Ethiopia. At one time, it was the pre-Aksumite capital in Ethiopia. And I went there in 2005, and here are 3 boys reading a manuscript, probably 19th century, not terribly old, but nonetheless a manuscript. And you can see around the corner the priest who is teaching them to read Ge'ez, the traditional ecclesiastical language of Ethiopia, has the good book, which is the modern printed copy. So let the boys play with the manuscript while he keeps the new book. And so what happens to a manuscript like this? Well, a tourist comes and offers them 50 euros, because that's a lot of money when you're poor in Ethiopia. And then the next thing you know, it ends up on eBay. So there is a constant flow of manuscripts, particularly from Ethiopia, including some very nice ones, as well as from areas of conflict like Syria, like Iraq, which find their way either through fairly open market channels like eBay or through other market channels into the hands of private collectors. An example of this is a manuscript that we microfilmed in Ethiopia in the 1970s. Very important 15th century biblical manuscript, which today can be found in a prominent private collection in Scandinavia. And some of you may be able to figure out whose collection it is. And when you see the provenance for the manuscript, all you have is the name of a dealer. So this is a manuscript that should not have left the country, because it left the country after the introduction of the laws which govern the export of cultural heritage. So when you have a situation like this, what do? Well, one might suggest that you should call a monk. So there's a stereotype that we, at least at one point in time, spent much of our days copying manuscripts. And it's certainly true that monasteries in every great religious culture, whether it's Christian or non-Christian, have been places which have often been committed to the preservation of significant texts, which in the pre-modern era meant copying them by hand. But the actual inspiration for the project that my monastery started 50 years ago was not so much the Dark Age or medieval monk hunched over the copy stand, copying out yet another copy of the Rule of Benedict or another Bible, but it was rather the early modern Benedictines from the Morist congregation. Now, some of you will know about the work of the Congregation of Saint-Maur. It was a French Reform congregation of the primarily 17th and 18th centuries. And they were essentially the creators of the modern science of textual criticism and the creation of something that looks somewhat recognizable as a modern edition of a classical or patristic text. So this is one of my heroes, Jean Mabillon, who was the leader of this enterprise and one of the inventors of the science of Latin paleography and Latin diplomatics. And so his treatises on this subject are sort of foundational documents for the way that scholarship evolved in Europe, and the editions created by the Moorists, particularly of patristic texts, were largely fodder for the great work of Minya's Patrologia Latina and Patrologia Graeca, which were the great work of plagiarism, of course, in the 19th century, plagiarizing the work of the Benedictines who had gone before him. So the reason they were able to create these marvelous early editions was that the Benedictines of the Congregation of Saint-Maur undertook these voyages littéraires, where they would go across Europe, visiting churches and monasteries to find manuscripts. And some of them they would buy and take back to Paris, to Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and some of them they would copy. And it was on the basis of these manuscripts that they collected that they could begin to get some sense of the evolution of scripts, thereby inventing the modern science of paleography, as well as beginning to understand the principles on which one might edit a text. So the 1960s, which some of you in this room would remember, was the era of the Cold War, when we thought there might be a third world war, and that it would be nuclear, and that essentially Western culture in Europe would be vaporized in this tremendous nuclear catastrophe. One of the monks of our monastery thought we should go to Europe and start microfilming manuscripts in monastic libraries, because they might not exist in a few years if there is another war. So our founder, Father Oliver Kapsner, undertook a 20th century voyage littéraire in the VW bus. And some people here in this room of that same era will remember that in those days, when you wanted a road trip and have fun, you took one of these. And inside it was a microfilm apparatus. And so Father Oliver and his team, here it is, the monk in the back with the microfilm, the stack of medieval manuscripts. So this was not an immediate success, because an American monk, although one fluent in German, because he comes from a German family in Minnesota, appears in an Austrian abbey, one of these great Baroque facade monasteries like you saw. They're all older, but the buildings are more recent, and says, "We want to microfilm your manuscripts." And they think, you are Americans, you know how to make money, you're going to take something, why should we let you? Until after several refusals, he finally met a young abbot, recently educated in Rome, who understood technology and said, you will begin here. So this was at Kremsmünster in Austria. And the project spread across Benedictine monasteries in Austria. Why Austria? Because in Austria the monks kept their libraries. Whereas in Germany and other parts of Europe, the manuscripts all went into state libraries at the time of the secularizations. So started in Austria, moved into other countries in Europe, as people, whether because of fear about war or whether because of an interest simply in the preservation of manuscripts and access to them, allowed Father Oliver and his team to microfilm. And this we did between 1965 and 2003, working predominantly in Europe, but also the project in Ethiopia that I alluded to, photographing 93,000 manuscripts. It's a lot of manuscripts. So in 2003, as Istvan suggested, we made the switch to digital technology. And when you think about microfilm, it seems antiquated now, but in the 1960s, this still seemed fairly modern and cutting edge. And digital, similarly, is a modern technology. And some people found it curious that monks were using modern technology when people think of us nostalgically as always having a face toward the past. But of course, the truth about Benedictines is that we have always been early adopters. So the clock, so that you don't have to stay awake all night until it's time to ring the bell for the early night office. The printing press, because it's easier to print a book than to write it by hand. And similarly, the turn to microfilm, and then in 2003 digital, for our work with manuscripts. So imagine my delight when I discovered the Jean Mabillon iPhone case, which brings together the Morris tradition of textual preservation and scientific study with the use of modern technology. So instead of the microfilm studio in Austria, which you saw a moment ago, we now see scenes like this. So this is Istanbul. This is the Armenian Patriarchate in Istanbul, which has about 800 manuscripts, which are the only Armenian manuscripts still in the hands of the church in Turkey after the Armenian genocide. So here's 3 young Armenian students being taught how to digitize those manuscripts by Walid Murad in the middle, who is our field director from Beirut, a Maronite Christian who manages our projects throughout the Middle East and also in West Africa. Or this one, which is a recent photograph I took in Egypt of one of the monks of the Coptic monastery of Abu Bakr in the Wadi Natrun, which is ancient Scetis, who's been digitizing the Coptic manuscripts belonging to their library. Now, of course, the fruit of this is the kind of high-quality digital image that we've all become familiar with and increasingly expect when we work with, whether it be manuscripts or artifacts or art historical materials, which allows this kind of high-resolution imaging and then an access to the contents of the manuscript, which in some cases is better than what the naked eye can see on the page. So there is no replacement for the original, but with digital images you can do some things you cannot do with the original, just as you can do some things with the original you cannot do with a digital image. And all of these images come back to our place in Minnesota. I show it in the summer. In the winter, it's all white. So there's no reason to show you a photograph because we have a Canadian-Russian climate. But it's very beautiful in the summer. And there we put the digital material on our storage servers. And so we keep a live copy of it running at all times locally for local access, and then for the new digital platform that I'll describe at the end. And being Benedictines with a long memory and remembering the Vikings and living on the Canadian border where you're never sure what they're going to do, we put a copy of everything backed up on high quality archival digital tape inside a granite mountain in Utah, southern United States, which is next to the mountain where the Mormons put their microfilm. You may know that the Church of Latter-day Saints has microfilm genealogical records. So they have all of their microfilm in one mountain, and we have our stuff in the other mountain, just in case. So to wrap up the technical before we go on to the places, just to give you some idea of the results of what we've done over the 50 years we've been active. The 93,000 manuscripts microfilm that I mentioned earlier, something more than 50,000 digitized since 2003, and the vast majority of these are books. So this is 50,000 codices, so it's far more than 50,000 images. We think it's something close to 10 million unique image files since 2003. In the original out-of-the-camera, non-compressed image format, it's about 150 terabytes. So that's a lot of vacation photos or iPhone snapshots that we have to take care of. And it's about 5,000 manuscripts a year in recent years. And then the cataloging, which is much slower, of course, is in process. And I'll say a word about that when we come to the end as well. So now we go to some of the places. So we mentioned Mesopotamia. Yes, here's the list of places. Then we see the photographs. So currently and recently, we've been active mostly in the Middle East and Africa, but we've also worked in India, and we do have work continuing in Malta with archival material. That's a whole other story that I could tell on another occasion. But you can see the interesting itinerary, which is my travels and the places where we've been active in recent years. And so I'm going to go to some of these places with you and say a little bit about why we were there and what we found, and then, of course, an update on the current situation. So let's travel. So Istvan in the introduction referred to Mesopotamia, which was an area of interest of mine at various points in my research. It has also been an area where our most fruitful manuscript work has been done. But of course, Mesopotamia as a geographical region covers modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. So the greatest concentration of our projects since 2003 has been there. This is a view of the Mesopotamian plain from Mardin in southeast Turkey, which is a very picturesque town, which is now about 75,000 people, predominantly Kurdish. Until the 1920s, it had a very significant Christian population. But as a result of the 1915 Armenian genocide, then the 1922-1923 Sefo, or the attacks on the Syriac Christians, the Christian population of Mardin has been reduced to about 100 families. But that doesn't mean that the culture is not evident. There is still an active church, probably 5th or 6th century, Syriac Orthodox Church of the 40 Martyrs. There are other churches, but there is only one priest. So here's the pastor, Father Gabriel Accuse, and he and his wife, with their 14 children, are doing what they can to repopulate the Christians of Mardin. But it's more than what one couple can do. But in that church, you can see the nice tower in the back, and here he comes at us. In that church are 1,200 of the most important Syriac manuscripts in the Near East. They were seen by Arthur Vubis in the 1960s. Some of you know his name as the indefatigable Estonian Syriacist, who published some texts from this collection. But they have been largely inaccessible, at least to Western scholars. So things like this beautiful 13th century gospel book. This is the Gospel of John with an image of Pentecost. So it's a kind of juxtaposition of two stories. And other texts in the attic of the church. Now they're digitized. Just down the street is a Chaldean Catholic church. This has not had a priest since 1969. But it had a very important manuscript collection, as did the Chaldean church in Diyarbakir, which is to the east. Diyarbakir you may recognize as a name much in the news because it's the real center of the Kurdish uprising against the Turkish government. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the manuscripts of Diyarbakir and Mardin were cataloged by a Chaldean archbishop named Adai Sher. And many of us still refer to these manuscripts by the Sher shelf mark. Adai Sher was shot in 1915 as part of this wave of persecution of local Christians. And his library at Seyert, which was his archiepiscopal see in eastern Turkey, was completely destroyed. A library that had some extremely important texts, including at least one unique text, which he never had the opportunity to publish, the treatise of Theodore Mopsuestia on the Incarnation. So Adai Sher cataloged the two collections, and they seem to have disappeared in the late 1960s, we thought taken to Iraq. We went to Iraq, and we found out they were left at the church, but nobody remembered that they were still there, except one man who had the key. So the secret is always find the guy with the key. And it may not be the bishop, it may not be the abbot, it may not be the priest, it may be the humble jeweler, as it was in this case, who opened the collection to us, and now this has been digitized. We started our work in Syria in 2005, very soon after we started initially in Lebanon. And of course, Syria has been a scene of great cultural devastation. Most of our work was in Aleppo, this magnificently cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and ancient city, which at one time had a significant Jewish presence until the 1950s. Then has had this mix of Christian population, some of them ancient, some of them refugees from Turkey in the early 20th century, and of course has been on the very front line of the current Syrian civil war. In Aleppo, you have, for example, the sole complete copy in the original Syriac of the Royal Chronicle of the Syrian Orthodox Patriarch Michael the Great, Mikhail Rava. The manuscript was kept in Urfa in Turkey until 1923. That's ancient Edessa, which is considered the kind of birthplace of classical literary Syriac. It had been seen in the late 19th century and copied for a Western scholar who published it, but essentially it disappeared after 1923 when it was taken to Aleppo with the Christian population of the city who left Urfa to go to Aleppo for safety and brought the manuscripts and the key to their church. This has now been digitized, and we have a high quality digital archive of it, as well as a printed facsimile, which was printed by Gorgias Press and is now being translated along with the other versions of the Chronicle. In 2010, we presented the facsimile to the Syrian Orthodox Metropolitan of Aleppo, Mar Gregorios Yohanna Ibrahim, who had become a close friend and a strong supporter of our project. Those of you who follow the news of this community will know that in April of 2013, Mar Gregorios, along with his Antiochian or Rum Orthodox colleague, Boulos Yazigi, their archbishop, they were both kidnapped on their way back to Syria from Turkey, and they've not been heard from since. So the two most significant Christian communities in Aleppo, now without leadership, but I'm happy to say that the manuscripts of the Syrian Orthodox, as well as of the Greek Catholics and the Syrian Catholics and the Armenians, have all been digitized. There were a couple of other libraries we didn't do, but we hope that they are safe, and we'll see if we have an opportunity in the future. So, to keep the happy theme, we go to Iraq. So, we started the digital work in 2003, and we began in Lebanon, and we started the work in Lebanon the week that the Americans invaded Iraq. So everything we've done since our digital turn in the Middle East has been done against the backdrop of that war, and then the progressive dismemberment of Iraq, and then the Arab Spring, and then everything that's happened since the Arab Spring. In 2008, we were finally able to establish a working relationship with somebody in Iraq. And that partnership has been with Father Najib Mikhail, who's an Iraqi Dominican. So here you see the Dominican white and the Benedictine black in a rare partnership as the original religious order of the Western Church and one of the upstart religious orders meets above the plain of Nineveh in northern Iraq. So Father Najib, who's an Iraqi Chaldean Catholic, now a member of the Dominican order, is part of the Dominican Priory of Mosul. And the Dominicans went to Iraq in 1750 as missionaries, originally Italians, later French, now they're all Iraqi. And their original mission, of course, was to convert Christians to Catholicism. And they had some success with this, but they seem to have spent much of their time doing ethnography, learning languages, studying villages, early into photography, fascinating archive. The Dominicans had to leave Mosul already in 2008 because of kidnapping threats. So they relocated to the Christian village of Karakosh between Mosul and Erbil in the Nineveh Plain. There, Father Najib trained young Iraqis how to clean manuscripts and digitize them, gathering manuscripts from all over the country, but mostly from the north, digitizing them, then returning them to their owners, boxed and clean, with a copy of all of the images. So we've been working with him now since 2009 formally, even as we've seen these dramatic changes fall across northern Iraq, starting in the summer of 2014. The fall of Mosul in June, which of course this great shock, which is still reverberating throughout the country. And then in August of 2014, the move of ISIS east, moving toward the Kurdish area and taking over all of these ancient Christian and Yazidi villages between Mosul and Erbil. They had a few hours notice to get out, and they grabbed what they could. And so 40,000 people relocated to Erbil, where they live in conditions like this. They leave in 2014. I took this photograph in March of this year. So we still have refugees living in this kind of situation, trying to figure out what they will do, knowing that they may never go back. So this Yazidi woman who's living with the Christians in this refugee center run by the Dominicans, explaining how when her daughter-in-law, standing behind her, was unable to have a child, she went to the church to pray to the Virgin Mary. So this is a Yazidi woman doing this. This is the way religion has worked in this part of the world for a very long time until now. So what we're seeing is that curious coexistence and sometimes actual overlap, cultural and religious practice, now made impossible. And so young families like this one, the child had been born the day before we visited in March, having a sense that they will never go home. So, what is the good news we take out of this? Well, these are communities that will reconstitute themselves, at least temporarily, somewhere else. The somewhere else now is Erbil, capital of the Kurdish region. Next, it could be Sweden, or it could be Germany, or it could be San Diego in the United States, or it could be Argentina. But fortunately, much of the manuscript culture of these people has been photographed. Thanks to Father Najib's energy and then the technical support and funding we were able to bring because of our own generous funders. So let's go to another fun place and say something about the work we've done in Jerusalem. So here you have arguably the most contested piece of religious real estate in the world. So you've got the Haram al-Sharif, you have the Western Wall, and then you have these little Christian communities tucked precisely in this area, which is very close to the Haram al-Sharif or the Temple Mount, however you wish to call it. Our first work there was with the Syriac Orthodox, and Istvan Pertzel played a role in establishing this relationship for us. Here's our friend Abuna Shimun reading a Syriac Bible text for a reporter from National Public Radio. And here is the magnificent 7th century manuscript of the Book of Steps, which figured in my doctoral dissertation, which is in their library and has now been digitized. Since 2013, we've also been working with several of the prominent Muslim families of Jerusalem, because they heard what we were doing with the monks, and they said, what about us? We have libraries, we have ancestors who established these great manuscript collections, and the people who historically have used our manuscripts are no longer able to come to Jerusalem because of the building of the separation barrier. So they may be 5 kilometers away, but they can't get to the library to see the manuscript. So in their mind, digitizing it means they can serve their local patrons who can access it through our website. So for example, one of these libraries, the Al-Budayri Family Library, the door is right next to one of the entrances onto the Haram al-Sharif. So this has got to be considered a location where manuscripts are endangered. So upstairs, they're digitizing them, and if you look out the window, this fantastic view of the Dome of the Rock. So it's beautiful, but you also have to say, isn't this dangerous? So to sum up the Mideast, before a brief turn to Africa, let me show you some numbers. And I'll try to spare you a lot of numbers, but you need to understand the magnitude of this. So we started in Lebanon, then to Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Jerusalem, Egypt. I'll break this down by language a little later. But since 2003, we've been able to photograph over 21,000 manuscripts in a number of different languages. And the thing to note is that in Iraq at least, 2,000 of those manuscripts are known to have been destroyed in Mosul. Others possibly destroyed. In Syria, in many cases, we have no idea. We think most of them were taken to safety in Lebanon or hidden somewhere in government-held areas of Syria, but at least for the foreseeable future, the only way to see them is through the digital survey. So this is another case where it's not simply to make life more convenient for the scholar, it makes life possible for the scholar because it's the only access. So, last stop, next to last stop, a quick word about Africa. So we worked in Ethiopia since the 1970s, and I love this photograph of our then director, Dr. Julian Plant, and the Emperor Haile Selassie. So you sign the contract, and next thing you know, there's a revolution. So this seems to have been a pattern in some of our projects going all the way back to Ethiopia. But miraculously, over the next 15 years, despite all of the tumult in Ethiopia and the severe repression of the ensuing regime and then a civil war, about 8,000 Ethiopian manuscripts were microfilmed. And the catalogs produced as part of this project have essentially rewritten and recreated the understanding of Ethiopic literature. More recently, we've returned to Ethiopia, and I'll just give you two examples. One is a partnership in Harar in eastern Ethiopia, which is the center of Ethiopian Islam, and a magnificent place where the Islamic world meets Africa. And we've been partnering with the Sharif Harar City Museum in creating digital copies of about 1,000 Arabic manuscripts in Harar. And these are very interesting because they're essentially Yemeni manuscripts which found their way to Ethiopia. So this is a project we're very proud of. It was actually the first project we did that focused largely on Islamic material. More recently in Ethiopia, at the monastery of Abu Garima, which some of you may know from its famous manuscripts of the Gospels, thought to be the two oldest Ethiopian manuscripts at least known, we negotiated with the guardians of the manuscripts, who are formidable, and under the watchful eye of the monastery guard, we digitized these magnificent manuscripts which have been carbon dated to the 5th or 6th centuries. So there are lively scholarly arguments about this. Is the parchment of that era and the painting perhaps, but the writing later? How could they have done something like this in Ethiopia so early? Lots of arguments, but the good news is now we have high quality images which will become publicly available, which can support these debates. Our largest current project is actually in Mali, in West Africa, with the manuscripts of Timbuktu. And some of you have read the story about the miraculous evacuation of the archives and manuscripts of Timbuktu in advance of the takeover of Timbuktu in 2012. And if you've read these accounts, you know that a member of one of the prominent families of Timbuktu could tell in the way that local people often can that something was going on. And so he packed these family libraries into metal boxes, took them up the Niger River to Bamako, the capital of Mali, so from the desert to the humid atmosphere of the capital, where they have sat in storage depots since then, and then gradually are now being unpacked in a massive international collaboration. A lot of support from European governments and agencies. We're providing the digitization assistance. And so now the manuscript books and archives of Timbuktu are being digitized. So here's a poem in praise of the prophet, for example, a particularly beautiful image because you see like a lovely old wrinkled face of a wise elder. You see a manuscript that has been through a thing or two. And last stop on the travelogue, because Istvan is in the room, we have worked in India, and this is all in partnership with Istvan Pertzel and his colleague, Father Ignatius Payapali, with manuscripts and archival material belonging to the St. Thomas Christians or Syriac Christians of Kerala in southwest India. So Father Ignatius, with their famous carving of Christ, who looks like another famous religious figure, which is an intriguing example of what happens when, in this case, probably a Portuguese prototype, who knows, goes native. And then working with their palm leaf material. Some of you know that many places in Asia record their written materials on palm leaves, which are dried and inscribed. They can be bound together with string to make a book, or they simply are in long strips where they would write property deeds or loans or this kind of archival information or letters. And many thousands of these have now been digitized and are in the process of being organized and made available. So, a word about challenges, then finally a word about access. So there are challenges. One of them I illustrate with this, which is a slide showing the 5 patriarchs of Antioch. Simultaneous, 5 patriarchs of Antioch. So when you work with these Middle Eastern Christian traditions, you need to know who they are, what they represent, what their history is, and you have to keep them straight. And you have to encounter each one of them on their own terms. And some of them are very tech savvy and understand all of this. In other cases, this is actually 2003, with the great late Rome Orthodox patriarch, whom I really grew to love and respect, but he really had no idea what a digital camera was. And so for all of his learning, this was new. So there's a process of explanation, just like Father Oliver had to do with microfilm back in the 1960s. In other cases, it's kind of a hard landing. I won't tell you which airport this is in, but it's one of my favorite airport signs in the world. So that descent is always a little sharp. I don't know why they thought they should paint it this way, but so they did. And then there are other situations where you don't know where to turn. This is actually in Ukraine, and we did some significant work in Western Ukraine with Slavonic manuscripts. That's a whole other story. But it's one of those places where often you find yourself feeling like this. And the truth of this intersection is that you could not go straight ahead either. All you can do is true, but they don't tell you. All you can do is reverse and try again. All right, so to sum it up, my last numbers before I show you our new web platform. So when we think about Eastern Christian manuscripts, Syriac, Ethiopic, Armenian, Christian Arabic, and you think about the manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale or the Vatican Library, the British Library, these great Western collections that we all use all the time for our work, and you add up what they have for actual manuscripts, about 9,000 in these languages. And these are admittedly, in many cases, the very best, because they skimmed the cream when they took them in the 18th and 19th centuries. So what we've photographed from the same cultures is over 36,000. And very few of these known to Western scholars. So when you think about PhDs and a next book and future research, here it is. Because much of this really has been virtually unstudied. And then when we turn to this kind of growing edge, the work we're doing with Islamic manuscripts, the collection in Ethiopia, we now have 530 archived. There's some more to come. 4 of these Muslim family collections in Jerusalem, representing over 3,000, largely Arabic, but also some Turkish and a few Persian manuscripts. And then the Timbuktu project, which is astronomically high. Many of them archival documents, so the number is misleading. But the incredible history of this great desert crossroads and kingdom, which again has been very little studied, at least by Western scholars, because they couldn't have access to material. So access, and this is my last thing I want to say something about. So last October, we launched a website that we call Virtual HMML. And of course, being here in Central Europe, you catch the pun on our acronym, Hill Museum Manuscript Library, HMML, which we call HMML. So this is heaven for people who work with manuscripts. And so our virtual presence, we call VHML. And in October, we launched the first phase of this website, which you can visit now. And that consists of educational resources for manuscript studies. So we launched it with Latin paleography, a very good Latin paleography online school with very high quality images and walking you through all of the many Latin scripts. And Latin is actually the most complex paleography of all of these sort of Christian languages. It also has Syriac. So I know that there are people here interested in Syriac. Lots of transcribed and described Syriac manuscripts representing all of the script types that we're familiar with from the study of Syriac. Coming soon will be Armenian, Ge'ez, Arabic with a sort of orientation toward Christian Arabic initially, but then broadening out. And probably after that, the next is Persian. So we're really developing these resources. You'll also find on that site the opportunity to transcribe manuscripts from images and match your transcription to that of an expert, a lexicon of key terms, a bibliography, which is continually being augmented with links to digital copies of key texts where they are available on archive.org, and so on. In July, we're going to launch something more exciting, which is the online reading room. And this is when you'll finally be able to read some of these manuscripts that I've been describing to you in terms of their capture and field work, actually be able to read them online. So we will launch in July with several thousand digital surrogates online. And over the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to put everything up. So this is a massive effort of cataloging and also simply data handling. But it's a great site. It's got very good search tools. We've worked hard on standardizing our cataloging. If you use our current online catalog, it's a mess. I'm the first to admit it. It's not always consistent. It's hard to find what you want. This is going to be much, much better. And then you'll be able to view the images. Many of them will require that you create an account, but it's free. You have to sign up. We have to verify you're real and honest. We'll give you permission. And then you can go from there and start exploring. So you'll be able to browse complete manuscripts with very good manuscript descriptions. They have permanent URLs, which enable you then to refer to them in your own research by a permanent identifier, links to external authorities to verify names, all of this kind of thing that's standard in these kind of digital humanities projects. And the cataloging does incorporate native script and titles in all of these languages. So the base language is English, but it's very enriched with things like transcriptions of incipits and explicits, colophons, titles, author names, and so on in the native form wherever possible. And then, of course, you can go full screen, and you can devote your entire laptop or monitor to looking at it. And the resolution of the images is such that you can do quite in-depth analysis. So we've become spoiled now. We think it should always be like this. So we have to meet and match your expectations. Another one of the features that is important is incorporating tools that will enable users to offer corrections or supplemental information. So you just click on this, you'll get a form, and you tell us what we got wrong or what we could add. And the thing that's valuable about this is for collections like Timbuktu, which are enormous and will not be cataloged completely for a very long time, we can put them up now with very minimal descriptions and invite people to participate in this very long process of cataloging. Behind that is a new cataloging interface, which I've shown some people here, which we're happy to share with people who have digital projects, who want to see how we create metadata structures or cataloging norms. Happy to give you access and to see it. Or people who would like to catalog some of those many tens of thousands of manuscripts that we photographed. You can do it wherever you are. So you can sit in your favorite coffee shop that has Wi-Fi, and you can catalog using the online interface. And we're very pleased with this. It was a lot of work to come up with the proper structure. This is much more complicated than you would think. And we've created a system that can do both manuscript books and archival material. And the way you describe those two things is actually quite different. Another thing that this catalog enables us to do is identify the current status of the manuscript. So we can say it's still there, or it's verified as destroyed, as is the case for many things in Mosul, or it's been relocated, because they took it to Lebanon or somewhere else, or it's missing, we don't know, or it's been sold, like that Ethiopian manuscript that's now in Scandinavia. And so in a sense, we can also create a kind of database of missing, stolen, or lost cultural property. And this is a very big thing in the art world, particularly related to what happened with art during the Nazi era and the Second World War. But as we're aware, the same kind of thing is happening now with the sort of movable cultural assets. So we're virtual, but we're also real. So come to see us. We've had people from CEU come on our research fellowships. We have short stay stipends that you can read about on our website. We invite you to come. In the summer, it's beautiful. You can swim in the lake. You can walk in the woods. In the winter, you can get a lot of work done. But we do have a very nice, recently renovated reading room. We'll give you a study here. We have an excellent reference collection for manuscript studies in a number of different languages. And we're really augmenting the Oriental Christian and Islamic manuscript reference material now because of our recent work. So you can find out more, these links. So I think I'll just leave these on the screen. And with that, happy to take questions. Here.
Two questions. One is, obviously, some of them have images, and it's obvious, and I'm sure you've seen them. But it occurred to me that while you're going to these places, clearly there are also artifacts. And while you're there and you're photographing, etc., and the artifacts are often related to the material, be they icons or others, have you thought about just preserving? I mean, they are obviously often very valuable, they're precious metals, they too could disappear or be stolen or whatever. So is there a way in which, or do you really just have to focus on the manuscripts, otherwise it's an endless thing? But they're so linked up together.
They are linked up together. So people sometimes say, how many people work at HMML? And I think I'm going to say we have 30 people in Minnesota. We have a staff, full-time equivalent, of about 11 people who do all of this in Minnesota. And then the local people who do the photography. So I don't think I actually said, the way we do our work is we train local people. You saw the young Armenians in Istanbul. You saw the monk in Egypt. We don't touch the manuscripts. So we train and pay local people. So that's what makes it possible. So given the resources that we can find through fundraising and grant writing, which of course is a large part of what I do, we have to focus. Having said that, there are other people who focused on epigraphy, icons, and this kind of thing. And when we have a camera set up at a project, we tell them, if you want to use it for something else, that's your business. So, nights and weekends, take the camera for a walk and photograph other things you have, or sometimes photograph private archives. But that's not our focus. We don't have the expertise, and we really have to stay focused.
But when you have images within the manuscripts, how are they treated in terms of descriptions and so on?
So they're always noted in the catalog. And one of the nice things about the new catalog is it's much better at highlighting those features so that you can search on them directly. So you can say Syriac, illuminated between the 16th and 18th centuries, and you'll get everything that meets those criteria. So this really should help people who are interested not so much in text, because traditionally manuscripts were all about text and only text, but now they are more and more about things in addition to text. And the color digital allows access to aspects of the material culture of the manuscript as well as to the art of the manuscript in a way that black and white microfilm never did. You may know that Jules Leroy did a very important book in the 60s on Syriac manuscript illumination, and all the photographs are black and white. And we've now digitized many of those same manuscripts in color. And you read his text and he has to tell the reader what color they are, because you can't infer it from the photo. Now you can see it yourself.
Is there an Islamic
is there an illegal smuggling activity? People tell us yes, in Iraq and Syria. I haven't seen direct proof about these manuscripts that we photographed. But it's entirely possible that manuscripts from places like Mosul, where the caregivers had to leave and leave them behind, that some of those could have been sold rather than destroyed. Because we know that other cultural artifacts are being sold. And there are these stories that much of the economy of the Islamic State is being run on illicit antiquities, which tend to be, I think so far they tend to be more things like carvings, statuary, where there's a kind of collector's market, but a manuscript is potentially just as valuable. So I imagine we will be hearing and learning more about that. But I haven't seen an example of a manuscript. Maybe some of you have.
Yeah, I went to a thing recently by under actually who had a lot of it's all there, and they tear out the stamp from the off, but unfortunately they don't realise that other parts are stamped from off.
And it may be that it's simply a larger market for Islamic material because there's more of it, or maybe more of a market for it. So we'll see what emerges, I think, in coming years in terms of that. What else?
Thank you so much, Mr. Papa. Could you tell us a little bit about the side manuscripts from Jerusalem?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you said family archives?
So they're family libraries. So it's the Badawi family, Khalidi family, the Husseini family, and then a very interesting small collection belonging to Sheikh Abdulaziz al-Bukhari. So it's a little Sufi collection. It's only 50 manuscripts, but he was a very interesting figure. And it's a kind of little island, small little island in Jerusalem. So they consist of a lot of standard texts. They have been cataloged, and the catalogs are publicly available, so people have some idea of what's in them. But now they'll be much more readily available. So it's everything you would expect, but there are always surprises. And as I say, mostly Arabic, but some Ottoman Turkish and some Persian as well. And we will be putting some of those up probably late summer, early fall. But if you know the current catalogs for those collections and there's something you want, let us know. So this is true of all of this. So just because it's not yet in our online catalog, or it won't be in the reading room yet, doesn't mean you can't see it. So if there's something you know is from one of these libraries, we can put it online for you, and we'll send you a password to a kind of private site, all free, and you can work on it even now, before it's in the new system. We've been doing that now for a few years. Works okay as a provisional strategy.
How do you deal with collections? Do you digitize everything, or is there some kind of time limit, like for everything as a manuscript? And how do you start to work with this? And there is the collection, and which part do you start from?
So we do everything that's handwritten. And normally we would say every handwritten book. So archives are by exception. But in some cases, like Timbuktu, that's an essential part of the program. So we say every handwritten book, because we don't feel competent to decide now what will be important for someone later. And so people say, what's the most recent manuscript you digitized? And southeastern Turkey and the Tuareg, we have manuscripts from the early 1990s, written in ballpoint pen. And we know the date because they're written in an agenda book. So it's like a 1991, desk agenda that someone never used as an appointment book, but they copied a text because there was no printed edition. And this is before the PDF that you could get from your friend in Sweden who would send it by email. So if you wanted a copy of the Bagrius on the 8 Thoughts, or you wanted this particular memra of Jacob of Sarud, you had to copy it in ballpoint pen. Now, you might say this is why I photographed this, because this is recent and we have other editions. This is really fascinating. The people in the 1990s wanted to copy a traditional text. So what does that tell you about the intellectual life of this region? So we say, shoot it all. and then let the future decide what's important, and then that will change from century to century. Anything else? Ishwan.
Malayalam.
What about it?
Somehow I was missing that from the statistics. Is it because you Indian, those scholars who have you in the Indian project are lazy to give you the numbers?
Ishwan, it would be helpful if we had some cataloging from you. Yes, this could be helpful.
That's an important part of this.
It is an important part, and maybe you and I can sit together these days. We can make another column for the chart with the Malayalam. Because the Syriac number does include the Syriac materials from India.
I think it includes some Malayalam as well.
Possible. We'll talk about that. So it's a warm room. I thank you for your patience. And if anyone would like to stay around for a few minutes after, I'm happy to answer questions or tell you more about the new platform. Many of you are interested in that kind of thing. And well, Mary, one last
Just a tiny question.
Tiny
Not
question.
the application to foundations, but what sort of people nowadays, I mean, I don't mean you to name names, obviously. What sort of people, what sort of donors, personal donors, would be supporting this vision? I'm just really interested.
Okay, I forgot the funder slide, and I should have shown it to you. I always show it when I'm fundraising. So our major funder right now is a London-based foundation called Arcadia, which does environmental protection and cultural heritage protection. And they give away about £20 million a year to different organizations. So they're funding our field work, much of our field work. The sort of digital humanities tech side is funded by American foundations such as Mellon, Luce, and also a federal agency, the Institute for Museum and Library Services. But we do rely on private donors, and it's a matter of finding people who have an interest in what we do. Very few of them are specialists, because specialists do not have money. So you have to find somebody who studied history as an undergraduate and then became an investment banker and has a nostalgia. Or somebody who never studied humanities but is very concerned about the threat to culture.
Who's in the diaspora of these communities?
We've had some support from the diaspora of these communities, but the truth is they tend to support their own projects. And in many cases, they have more immediate needs. So the Chaldeans in the US should be supporting refugees in Iraq. And even some of our donors are supporting refugees in Iraq. So at this point, we're relying more on foundations and then just a wide variety of individual donors, some of whom have been very generous in keeping this going. We have an endowment that funds about 30% of our annual operations, and the rest is fundraising. So the stuff is safe, but to keep active in the field, we rely on these grants. Thank you.